David, getting back to the battle against ISIL, you know, there are many analysts who say that in some respects you're not fighting ISIL here as a fighting force, you're fighting an ideology. And it seems to be an ideology that has some credibility or currency with young people around the world. We've seen these attacks in Europe, we've seen these attacks in Asia as well. If you're sitting in the United States in Washington and looking at the options that you have, I mean, one of the options has to be defeating an ideology. Is that possible?
It's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
You know, there are elements of the Cold War struggle that had that as an aspect. But there's also going to remain the challenge of defeating a group, that the defeat of ISIS or ISIL is going to be a tremendous benefit for al-Qaeda. And al-Qaeda continues to have what may be upwards of 10,000, closer to 20,000 fighters in Idlib province in Syria. It recently sort of gained quite a bit at the expense of a rival, Sham. And for now, al-Qaeda has made clear, at least its intention is not to launch attacks on the West. It wants to entrench itself further, that this is how it sees the lessons of the initial phase of the war in Iraq and the several years following the US invasion and occupation, that it made too much of an effort to rule on its own terms. ISIS proceeded with that, had tremendous success with the caliphate for a short time, and then was defeated. Now, al-Qaeda is trying to learn from that. So the danger doesn't go away. It's in the form of many other groups. And of course, ISIS has groups elsewhere. I mean, a lot of attention in the United States is now focusing on a small ISIS splinter in West Africa, which has a limited success killing 4 American troops. In the Sinai, there's been some terrible violence as well. So it's global, and one of the big questions for Europe, for the United States, will be, in the absence of a larger territorial base, like the one in Syria and Iraq, will they be as able to launch foreign attacks, or did that capability really depend on having a sanctuary?
Right, and in West Africa we have groups that have aligned themselves. Boko Haram has aligned itself with ISIL, so have groups in Libya as well.
And yeah, so I just note that in West Africa, al-Qaeda, again, is the bigger threat. It has become #1 in Syria.
Right.
Also in West Africa, really under the heading of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they've begun to attack hotels, other sort of Western tourist spots. For a time, they held a lot of territory in Mali. They benefited from weapons and other things taken from Libya. So really, we have to have a conversation always about al-Qaeda and about ISIS. And anyone who makes the mistake of focusing on just one or the other is only seeing half the picture.
Ammar, the defeat of ISIL in Raqqa, what does that mean for the future of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian leader?
Well, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his government, they draw their legitimacy from quite a large base inside Syria, actually. There are a lot of Syrians, since the start of the the crisis in 2011, decided that this would be some sort of a threat, whether an economical threat, whether a social threat, whether an existential threat, you know, at certain degrees, and they decided not to join. And those people had then the only choice of sticking with the government in order to protect themselves. And this understanding is still there, this feeling is still there. So he will be for quite some time. It's very hard to imagine that he will be ousted in any political process, because basically 9 out of 10 Syrians who live inside Syria live currently under the protection, so to speak, of the Syrian government. They will not vote otherwise. They will not substitute security with chaos or whatever. So he won't be leaving the scene anywhere soon. Now, the issue is that there will be a lot of eager partners, either in the region, say some Gulf states, or some international players as well, key people like, for example, the United States or Western Europe, who would be working hard to undermine his authority and his government's authority. So now, having finished from ISIS or Daesh, it's going to take a long time for Syria to settle under a certain, coherent government, because there will be a lot of people who would say, well, we're going to establish like a local authority here, and we're going to protect, move in to protect, this ethnicity there. And the main objective of all this is going to be, to undermine the Syrian government, which is going to leave us. Go on.
Okay, Ammar, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson recently said that there is no place for Bashar al-Assad or his family in a future Syria. Point is that we've heard that from the Americans before, but if Bashar al-Assad goes, who replaces him?
Well, basically nobody. President Bashar al-Assad currently can be viewed as the trusted person who would run a coherent government, trusted, i.e., by the group of Syrians who decided to stick with the government. And at the moment, there is nobody else to replace him, and nor in the foreseeable future. They just won't allow it, they just won't accept it. The United States is trying to build some sort of a coalition or an acceptance in northeastern Syria to separate somewhat from the Syrian government territory. And this requires some sort of a cohesion and some sort of an alliance between Arabs and Kurds, the main ethnicities over there. Now, in order to do that, they would need to give the impression that the government in Syria is going to fall, that President Assad has no future, and so on. Once they establish that perception, people would find it easier to say, okay, well, if the government or the central government is going to be weak or it's going to fall, then let's hedge our bets and stick with the United States. They brought, for example, as well, a Saudi minister to Raqqa, basically promising Saudi money. They're trying to seduce people over there to accept some sort of a form of local governance along with the Kurds, in order to, establish some sort of an entity. I don't think it's going to happen. We keep in touch with a lot of people who are in the eastern in the eastern part of Syria. They know what's happening. They don't want this. There is no appetite, at least in Syria, to separate from the mainland, so to speak.
Abbas, if we look at the battle that Iraq is fighting against ISIL, is there the political will in Baghdad for a long, lengthy fight against ISIL? Because, I mean, if we look at this is a classic asymmetric guerrilla war, isn't it?
It is, but I think Iraq has defeated ISIS already. All what we have right now is a couple of areas in western Iraq, Al-Qa'im and Rawa, and they just started the operation to liberate them, and that will put ISIS completely officially out of Iraq. So the Iraqis have been sustaining a fight against ISIS for a good 3 years. The question is, again, I think the biggest challenge is not the fight. The fight is over. It is just how to meet the challenges, financial, political, and social challenges of the post-ISIS era, and how to prevent another acronym, not necessarily ISIS, to come again and repeat the disastrous saga that happened after June 10, 2014. That is a great challenge, and I think the Iraqi government needs to be smart enough to take care of this question.
Okay, Hiwa, I want you to take a listen to what the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had to say about this dispute between the government in Baghdad and Iraqi Kurds. Let's watch this.
We are concerned and a bit saddened by the recent differences that have emerged between the Kurdistan regional government and the Iraqi central government. We have friends both in Baghdad and we have friends in Erbil, and we encourage both parties to enter into discussion and dialogue. I think if both parties commit themselves to a unified Iraq, to the Iraqi constitution, I think all differences can be addressed.
So, Hiwa, the Guardian newspaper pointed out recently that the Kurds in Iraq have been very loyal to Western interests in that part of the world. In fact, they've led the fight against ISIL in many respects. Is it time for some kind of payback from the West? What would you like to see the United States, or for that matter, the United Kingdom, do?
Well, I think, what we heard from Secretary Tillerson is proving that America, the United States of America, is becoming less and less relevant in Iraq, less and less influential, and Iran is becoming more and more influential with every day that passes, with every new crisis. Iran is the country that is very influential in Iraq, and it is the one that will ultimately call the shots. And we will meet in a year or 2 or 3 years' time. There will be more talk about General Qasem Soleimani or his replacement in Iraq than somebody like Secretary Tillerson or President Trump, for that matter.
David, one final point, and that is, what is the Iranian role in all of this?
Well, I think Iran is very happy to see Baghdad and Erbil fighting, that it's a humiliation of a traditional American ally, the Kurds. They saw a situation where Washington didn't do much to prevent the conflict or protect someone perceived as its ally. Iran is trying to build a set of countries from Tehran to the Mediterranean that it effectively controls the capital, controls the politics. That's why it's so invested in Syria. That's why it's fought with such extreme brutality, why it doesn't have a problem with Assad using chemical weapons on its own people. It recruits even child soldiers from the Afghan community in Iraq and sends them to Syria. So it's pulled out all the stops. It's brought in Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization. And they're concerned. Of course, President Obama was more willing to recognize what he called the equities that Iran had in the region. President Trump has signaled a very different policy, beginning with the decertification of the nuclear deal. Now, the big question that Trump has to face, that Tillerson has to face, is do they realize that their ambition to push back against Iranian influence means taking a more active role in both Syria and Iraq? There are many people in the United States very tired of the deep conflict, of having American soldiers over there. They want to pull out. But at the same time, if the president's #1 priority is preventing Iran from going nuclear and from consolidating control over the region and, putting in place brutal regimes like Assad, keeping them where they are, then they will have to take a more active role.
Abbas?
I just wanted to say something about what David just mentioned. I think, yes, Iran does want in Iraq that is not very strong. But I think we are framing the situation wrongly if we say that there is a dichotomy. The Kurds are a U.S. ally and Baghdad is an Iran ally. In fact, Iraq, both the Kurds and the Iraqi government are U.S. allies, and both of them also are Iran's allies. Iran was very important in helping the Kurds when ISIS attacked them, and that's both the admission of the Kurds and everyone else. And also, we have to remember that Iraq defeated ISIS with the help of a U.S.-led coalition. So I think the U.S. needs to look at both Baghdad and Kurdistan as allies and not start to think about Baghdad as an enemy and the Kurds are there.
Yeah, absolutely. Baghdad is not the enemy. It's Tehran who wants to manipulate Baghdad and Erbil to fight.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, with the only difference that if you are a friend of America, you're being taken from A to B. If you're a friend of Iran, you're their friend forever.
Okay, gentlemen.
They know how to keep their friends, unlike America.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Dido in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.